Okay, so I'm going to share screen, so just give me 1 second. Yep. And then portion of the screen. And I will ask someone. It does not need to be shared. And this should come up. Yep. In the beginning. And in a second, I'm going to ask somebody to tell me if you are seeing what I think you should be seeing. Yeah. So are you seeing a slide? Yes? Are you seeing a slide that says Living Through Crisis and Change with the title slide? Yes, everybody can see it? Okay, great. Thank you. I'm sorry to keep asking you, but it's important for me to know that we're all on the same page, that you're seeing what I would like to show you. Okay, so let me just put the faces down here. Okay. So again, welcome. There'll be people that might be joining as we go along. And so, you know, I will admit them as you know, if they're late and if they're joining us late. Some of you know me, some of you don't know me. So those of you who might know me socially, but less so professionally. So I'll take just a couple of minutes to say a little bit about who I am. My full name is Hannah-Valeria. I'm a licensed psychotherapist. I've did my training and worked for a while in the United States, in New York. I'm also a teaching member and supervisor of various sound play therapy associations, notably the International Society for Sound Play Therapy, which is an umbrella society for national sound play therapy associations. One of my specialties is working with trauma, so I'm a certified clinical trauma specialist. I've also lived in Britain, so therefore I'm also a member of the British Association for Catholic Psychotherapy, and I supervise other play therapists internationally. My areas of specialty are, I mean, it's a little bit difficult to narrow down from the 20 years of experience that I've had, but some of my areas of specialty are loss and bereavement. And there's some colleagues here that they know who they are, that have known this part of my work. I offer I work with trauma and offer trauma-informed therapy. I've often worked with immigrants or people who have lived in places where they weren't born, and as you probably even hear in my English, I've lived in a few places. I was born in the Ukraine and lived in the US and the UK, and now I live in Israel. So I have quite a lot of connection to what it's like to be an immigrant, also on a personal level. I also, my other specialty, psychotherapy, was children and families, and Jungian sound play therapy, which is a creative, nonverbal way of working with issues, and sometimes it really offers an opportunity to see something from a very different point of view. It involves a very creative, a very embodied way of working, which involves sand, water, and quite a lot of miniatures. And it gives somebody the opportunity to express something that may be very hard to access through words. I see there's a comment here. I'm just going to quickly look. Okay. No, it's nothing that I need to respond to right now. Okay, so I would like to start talking a little bit about the topic of this webinar, which is living through the time of crisis and change. And I would like to just, one second. I suppose I would like to begin by just saying some of you, I'm sorry, I'm just moving on slide, takes a second. I would just like to invite you to think a little bit about definitions of what crisis and change might be. Obviously, they seem pretty, I think on some level, they seem pretty obvious. But at the same time, I think, you know, we are living through a crisis. It seems to me that we're living through a crisis. 1 second, for some reason, I don't seem to be able to move through a slide, and I don't know why. So just give me a second. Oh, no. Okay. So it seems, on one hand, it seems pretty obvious that we're living through a crisis. I think most people would say that doesn't need much defining. But I think sometimes when you're so much inside of something that it almost requires you or forces you to kind of take a step back and say, well, actually, what is that? What is it that we're living through? And even if you look at the kind of dictionary definition, as crisis is defined at time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger, which I suppose today's situation, coronavirus pandemic, is probably meets that criteria pretty clearly. And what is it? How do we understand change? And I suppose the very obvious definition of change is an act or possibility of being different, or making something or someone different, or changing its state somehow. And it feels as though we've been in crisis, in some kind of form of crisis with this coronavirus pandemic for a while. It's been many months, and I suppose a question that I've been asking myself, and a question that it feels like it's been coming up for me in my work with my clients is, now that we have been in a crisis, we're in a crisis, can this crisis be a catalyst for a positive change, or a change that can bring some kind of fruitful result to us? Positive maybe is not a good word, because positive has a lot of we have associated all kinds of things with positive, but a result that can be of use to us. And if the answer to that is yes, so what needs to happen? What needs to happen for this to take place? And what I'd like to suggest is that unplanned crisis, which is what we've been pretty much dealing with, requires a mobilization of all kinds of resources on our part. And as this pandemic is going on and on and on, it feels as though, certainly for me and my work and my kind of social environment, it feels as though the resources that there might have been more of at the beginning of the pandemic seem to be running a little thin. And so what I'm hoping that we can do today together is to really look at how we can replenish our resources. What can we do to give us more support, for ourselves, and also how we can support children. Because I think initially much less attention was given to children and sort of what they need through this time. But I think, again, as this pandemic is going on and on and on, and time is moving onwards, I think it might be quite useful to reflect on what might be helpful for younger children, also for adolescents. So I'd like to offer you this image. Some of you probably know what I'm hinting at. But it's a really transformation to a butterfly. Actually, I think scientifically correct transformation to a butterfly. And you can see the change that this creature goes through in order to become a butterfly. And in the middle, can everybody see my cursor? Can you see my cursor on the screen? Yes? Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for nodding your head. So I know. So you can see in the middle, when it's going through this change, at some point it ceases to be in the state that it was in, and it's now going through that phase of change by basically not existing anymore in its previous phase. And I would like to suggest that this is a very powerful metaphor, that in order for transformation to take place, for change to take place, some aspects of us sometimes somehow almost cease to exist. Or in order for them to change and to develop or to grow into a different state of being, and we're talking about change, sometimes some parts of us or the environment around us has to literally lose its form. And it can be terrifying, because the form that we have that's all we have, is all we know. But I think it's a really powerful metaphor to keep in mind, because this process of transformation, as illustrated by this development, I think really can speak very powerfully to what's possible, and that sometimes in order to reach what's possible, something needs to be let go of, even if it's painful. So the question I'd like for you to keep in mind as I'm talking and as we're working together today, as we're thinking together today, is, can this crisis be an opportunity for us to change? Can this crisis be an opportunity for us to grow and reconnect to ourselves or to our life somehow more fully? So what I would like to propose as an idea that we can sort of explore today is that what does it take as we're asking this question, what does it take to live through this pandemic? What I'd like to propose are the 3 points. One is that it requires an active engagement with this crisis and the possibility of change. So rather than sort of being in a position where sometimes it's very tempting on us and for us, and I think at the beginning this was even more tempting to kind of be a bit more in a place of not wanting to think too much about it, or this isn't happening to us and isn't happening to me, and so. But I think now, seeing how long this has been going on for, I think we're probably, most of us are past that stage. But to actively consider that we are in this situation is that we're in, and this is a crisis, but that it may be possible, there may be a possibility of a useful change that can happen to us or can be manifest in our lives. The second point I'd like to suggest is the necessity of finding these psychological and practical strategies to address what's going on for you and for your family, because there's quite a lot that's going on. So we need to take care of that. And I think we need to actively think about what we can do to address it, and I suspect this will change. You know, what I would have said about this 3 months ago, and those of you who were in my grief seminar, we talked about something quite different a few months ago. But I think now, and what we might be talking about in 3 months from today might be different also. But regardless of what we may be saying in terms of what the strategies and what these resources might be, I think the issue in itself of needing to look for that, I think, is quite important. And the third point I'd like to suggest, which I think feeds the second point, is that somehow I wonder whether it's possible to find our own meaning, our own sense of how what's going on relates to our own purpose in life, our own mission in life, our own meaning that we bring to life, or life brings to us. And that will be very individual, very, very individual. But I think, and we may not always have a clear answer to that question or to this point, but I think just to be able to give yourself some space to think about that, explore that, I think can be incredibly soul nourishing and can be very kind of informative in terms of looking for strategies and looking for resources to support yourself and your family. So one thing that I'd like to say about particularly this phase of the coronavirus pandemic that I'm noticing, and I'd be interested to hear, of course, after when we share together, whether this is what you're noticing and what you're experiencing. But there's this term that's being thrown around and being discussed, and I think it's actually a very good descriptive term that's called pandemic fatigue. And what I think, what my sense is, what's being described by that term is this continued facing of these unknowns that is still very much part of our reality. Yeah? So if some months ago we were thinking that this will be over soon, there'll be some kind of resolution, we certainly wouldn't be talking about this now in November. But from what I can see, and we're looking around different countries, we are nowhere near any kind of clear resolution to this pandemic. So different countries are kind of going through sort of first stages of the vaccine testing, but that's still quite some length away from having a functioning vaccine that's available to everyone. And this never-ending, another point I think that's also very, very difficult is this never-ending shifting signpost of one sort of situational aspect of the coronavirus to what measures can be taken about it, and all of these things seem to be moving and never-ending sort of conveyor of what without kind of having any kind of stable point of clarity of what is happening now, what will be happening later. And it may very well be the nature of this pandemic, but it still doesn't take away from the fatigue and the stress of what that means to have to live that. And some of these unknowns are kind of some of them can be very concrete. So people who have, countries have lived through lockdowns, these are very clear limitations on your movement, limitations on what you can and cannot do, when, with whom, and how. The impact of all of that on the economic situation, of what that means for each one of us financially, and how that impacts our own feelings around our future. And that sense of people kind of becoming more reckless and restless, it's almost like we've had it. We've had it already. We're tired. We can't be bothered anymore. Certainly from my experience of being in Israel, so the first lockdown had much more feeling of we're all in it together. There's some kind of cohesiveness around this situation. We'll try to help each other. To now, that sense of exhaustion and just sort of sense of, this is just, I'm just tired. I'm just tired thinking about it. I'm tired of all of what's going on. And I think that has a very real impact on our psychological state and how we feel. I think there's, for me, in my observation from my work and my social life, I think there is quite clear manifestation of feelings of anxiety, sense of uncertainty, tension, and now much more obvious kind of expression of irritability and anger. Whereas before I felt the irritability of anger was a bit more concealed, whereas now it's much more out there, and it's something that cannot be, it's much harder to ignore, I think, now than before. Those of you who came to my webinar before, you will remember we talked about grief, and I think grief is a process. It's something that we deal with in stages, more or less, that are clearly defined, of course, but it's a process rather than an event. And so I think that's still very much part of the picture, but it's now part of the picture in a much greater sense of, in a much greater pool of other very stressful and complex emotions. And what I'm really struck by, and this is probably one of the reasons what kind of really inspired me to offer this webinar, is that what I'm seeing is that less available inner and outer resources, and I would include myself in it as well. I certainly finding myself having to really be paying a lot more attention to my own mental health, and to finding, to looking for ways to support and to nourish my own, my own world. I would say much more than I did before. So just checking to see if there are any questions. Like 1 second. Let's see if there's anything I need to. Yes. Okay. So Jean-Tay is saying that sounds like it's resonating. I think yes. Okay. So I would like to then invite us, if this resonates with people, then what do we draw this from, and how can we reconnect to ourselves, and to so that we can feel more able to use different resources, to feel more settled, to feel more grounded, to feel calmer, to feel more centered. And I think it's also very relevant for parents, because if we don't feel any of those things, it's very difficult to support children and help children to feel more grounded themselves. So one of the things that had dawned on me that might be helpful, and I hope you will find it helpful also, is that I like to think back to other people that came before us that have also lived through stress, pain, disasters. And what have they taken from their experience that might be of use to us? So I'll share with you two examples that have inspired me. I hope they'll be inspiring to you too. And one of them is Viktor Frankl. Probably many of you are familiar with his book called Man's Search for Meaning. Sorry, my mouse is again having a pause as well. And so I want to, he was a very famous, I believe, psychiatrist and neuropsychologist who was, I believe, in prison of 3 or 4 Nazi concentration camps. And when he left after the Holocaust, he had founded one of the branches of psychotherapeutic approach called logotherapy. And I chose this quote, I chose this picture, and I chose this quote that I think is very inspiring and pretty impressive. That comes from a person who had, who had lived through what he's lived through, and still was able to say that after having survived the Holocaust. And as you can see, everything can be taken from a man, but one thing: lust of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. which I've always found really mind-boggling to think about that kind of sense of inner freedom in concentration camp. I suppose that's why I find him so inspiring. So I'd looked at some of his writing, and here's the kinds of things that I thought might be helpful for us to consider in terms of what's happening, that might be relevant for our situation. I think might be relevant for our situation. What he seems to suggest is that our attitude, as obvious from this quote, is key. So it didn't, from his point of view, when he reflected on his experience and what were key moments in his experience, is that it didn't really matter, as he says, what we expected from life, rather than what life expected from us. And on one hand, it's sort of, I think sometimes it sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but I suppose what strikes me about it is that it puts us also in a position of active engagement with what's going on. So we're not only sort of recipients of what life is delivering to us, but also maybe how we can engage with life. How do we show up in life? What we bring to some of these painful and difficult circumstances and experiences. He placed a lot of emphasis on how we relate and how we live through what the painful experiences that we have to live with. He calls it a burden, but there's something very potent in his writing around his relationship to what he had to live with. So he didn't have a choice about that, but somehow that he was able to relate to it, and he was able to, that forced him to reflect on what were his values, what was important to him, why was it important to him. So in that sense, all of this can deepen our connection to ourselves and to what we think our own mission in life might be, or what we bring to the world, maybe very much our little individual world. I'm not talking about necessarily kind of like, massive, world events, but part of our world, whatever that world might be. And he placed also quite a lot of, I think in line with what he's already saying, that he's placed a lot of emphasis on kind of active engagement with the world. Being a psychologist, I don't necessarily think that he meant that, that when he says the true meaning of life is to be discovered in the world, not only inside of himself. I don't think he's necessarily saying forget about your inner world, you're into psychology, we're just interested in the outer world. I don't think he's saying that at all, but I think his emphasis is that it's so important to look at that relationship between oneself and what's going on outside. And the last point, but I think not the least, is he's also placed a lot of emphasis on the importance of not losing faith in the future, even without necessarily knowing what that future will look like. And in his case, that meant without necessarily knowing the release of when he would be released from the concentration camps. And obviously, we're not in that kind of crisis, but I just thought it was very remarkable to be able to still hold on to faith in the future and hold on to hope in such extraordinarily horrific circumstances. And when we often people talk about, I suppose a little bit less now, but before we used to, I hear a lot of people reflecting, saying that when we go back to how things used to be. But I almost feel like now I really hope that we don't go back to how things used to be. I really hope that we will take something from this experience, each one of us, and when things do begin to look a little bit more normal, when we can gather in large groups and are able to, go to the theater and fly without having to worry about, this, I don't know, masks and, never ending, the pandemic fatigue I was just talking about. That actually we don't just go back to how things were, that we'll have discovered something about our relationships, or we've discovered something different about ourselves, or we've hopefully maybe been motivated or inspired to do something different, or to be somehow different with ourselves, with our friends, with our family members, somehow, which again may be very different from person to person. So another person who inspired me personally in terms of thinking about what we can draw from this time is Natan Sharansky, who, again, some of you might know who he is. There was a famous dissident during the time of the former Soviet Union who wanted to immigrate and wasn't allowed to, and eventually was imprisoned in Soviet camps for, I think 9 years, if I'm not mistaken, and half of that time he spent in solitary confinement. So he's written a book called Fear No Evil, which I also find very inspiring and highly recommend it. And there are a couple of things that really jumped out from that book. You know, I read it many years ago, but it really kind of always stayed with me. And now I feel like it's so relevant to what we're going through. And he's been through very humiliating and very painful and very horrible situations and during the camps, during his time in the Soviet camps. And, you know, he often reminded himself that, you know, choosing his own attitude he has often said that choosing his own attitude in relation to his captors was key. And reminding himself that only if he was encountering a situation that he felt was humiliating or difficult or degrading to him, that as long as he did not take that on himself, as long as he was able to create a distance between that himself and the situation, he retained a certain core, a psychological core within himself. So I think there's something very powerful and something very potent in that, and it's not easy to do, but I think there's something very perhaps important to reflect on in that example. He also made a very particular point in believing in his mission. And for him, it was a very clear personal and collective mission. He wanted to immigrate from the Soviet Union. He identified strongly as a Jew, and he wanted to live in Israel. So there was a very strong sense for him around that personal story, his own personal story, and his own collective story around being part of his people. So again, I think this is where, you know, there's something for us here around finding our own personal story, our own personal meaning to what's going on, and what is our own unique contribution to what's, you know, to our, as I said, to our world, or to the, you know, to the small collectives that we all live in. Each one of us has a certain, you know, collective, and how do we show up in that collective? You know, what's our personal, you know, connection to that? And the third thing that I think is really particularly remarkable is that, you know, he talked quite often around giving up control over things that you can control, which again, I find extraordinarily in these kinds of circumstances. And I think this applies so much to us because there's so many things that we can control. And yet we feel, I think, the natural urge to want to control them. And this is something, you know, he didn't even know he would be released from the camps. And so somehow he had to, you know, he found ways of, you know, looking for ways to engage in things that he could control. So like, for example, he talked a lot about, he would play chess in his mind. He was a chess player, and so he would play chess in his mind by himself. So I think, you know, it's very tempting, I think, for us to want to want to control a whole bunch of things, which is very understandable. But I think sooner or later we realize that takes a lot of energy. And although we can try to do that, I think in the end, I think we'll often come to a realization that it's pretty futile. You know, and sort of an example I could think about is certainly in Israel, there's a whole big thing about wearing masks, and people should be wearing masks, and there's a law that you should be wearing masks, and so there's quite a lot of agitation where people don't wear masks for a very obvious reason. But very often you can't force people, you can't do very much about what your neighbors can do, but you can control what you can do. So you know, as we're kind of having considered this idea around the search for meaning, or looking for meaning in our pain, in our suffering, in our losses, I'm hoping that we can move forward thinking about our own relationship to it, our own sense of meaning, our own sense of our story, and what the situation has asked from us, and how we can show up in relationship to our life now, maybe quite differently to what we did before. And I think this is going to be very individual, again, from person to person. So I'd like to shift to talking a little bit about more practical strategies, for practical things around what we can do to help ourselves, to help our children. And particularly, I'd like to start talking about children because I think that they have been, many of them have been out of the routine or out of any normality, a sense of normality for so many months. So I'd like to start by just saying that children are incredibly resilient, unless they have had early traumas or basic reasons, specific reasons why that sense of resiliency might have been affected. Generally, children are very resilient. But it's very important to create conditions for your children to deal with this new reality. And I think as parents, this is really key to think about that, to think about what you're creating around your children for them to be able to engage in a way that allows them to relate, but also allows them to make sense of what's going on. So it's probably not going to be big shocking news if I say that children communicate much more through their behavior than they do verbally. And so I think it's really important to try to understand, for us adults, to try to understand what children's behavior means. So, and again, this is unusual, different situation. So, but I think the principle of that, I think, still very much applies here. Probably most of the adults here, I don't know, but I'm guessing most of the adults here probably had felt at times a sense of, a sense of stress, a sense of regression, a sense of, I don't want to get out of, the never ending jokes about your kind of pajamas, the ones for sleeping and the ones you're walking around the house that you're not even, you don't even want to get dressed and sort of look like you're facing the world or you're facing the outer reality. Well, it's very normal for children to regress under stress and regress in difficult situations. So keeping in mind, I think it's really important to keep in mind that they are not living under any kind of normal circumstances either. And whatever also you as parents are dealing with or having to sort of having to address also impacts them. Checking to see if there are any comments. Okay, no, that's fine. So one of the things I feel is really important, especially for younger children, it's to have what we say soft routine. What I mean by soft, it's a very good, I'm sure some of you are wondering what that means. A soft routine is having some kind of balance. If they're between what we would consider a routine, like a routine of life as it was before, when they had very, clearly defined school hours, extra hours for activities and social interactions. But if you are there at home, a certain routine is really important, but I think having some understanding about the flexibility around the times, flexibility around the activities, flexibility around what may be really resourceful to them can be very useful. Children really need social interactions, and obviously during the lockdowns or during the situations where those interactions are not possible, I think all efforts should be made, as much as possible to make sure that some social interactions can happen. This never-ending Zooming is important. Never-ending Zooming is not, well, it's sometimes the only thing that can happen, but if there is possibilities for them to play outside, or I know in some countries, I believe in the UK, there's this concept of the bubble, so that there are some households that people can, pair up and be in social interaction with. I think that can be also very useful to consider for other people in other countries, because I think it's very difficult for children to be, to be without a routine, without social interaction for months on end. So as a therapist who has worked for children for many, many years, I feel very strongly that games and play is really key for child development. And games and play that's less structured and geared more towards imagination is particularly resourceful for children on so many levels. So I would really encourage parents to make those resources available to children. And allowing them to make a mess, allowing them, buying them sort of like a plastic sheet, and helping them understand that in this container, in this space, they can make a mess, and that it's okay to make a mess. Now, you may find that there may be in their play, there may be examples of play related to the pandemic. So I've seen now children who make COVID-19 miniatures out of plasticine and clay, who talk about these things of disease, of illness, this invisible illness that's kind of floating around. A sibling of a client of mine made a video. I mean, at one hand, it's quite funny, but really, if you think about what's going on, you see that, another story behind it of making a mask. And so she was made a sort of a pretend educational video about how to make a mask and what's a mask and what it's for and how you do it. And it was funny on one hand, but at the same time, you can see that, she's trying to make sense of why all of a sudden you have to wear a mask when you leave the house, and why you see people in masks when you do leave the house. And there may be many other examples of that. So I think you might see more play with themes around that's related to the pandemic. Another really key point is that is really helping children to find words for their feelings. So helping children when you see their behavior that might be, where you could see that they're showing you something, or they're showing their inner world, their inner feelings, helping them to find words for it. So then, I wonder when you do that, I wonder if you're feeling like that. That's quite helpful to do in other circumstances also, but I think now in particular it's very important for kids to have a sense that they're understood. Also give them a feeling that they're being understood, and they're given tools to be able to express what's going on for them. I'm of the view that reading children old style fairy tales and stories are really very, very helpful, because they actually have a very kind of intense conflicts and intense stories to them, and things happen that are difficult. And sometimes I know there's a point of view that we shouldn't be reading, they shouldn't be exposed to it, because that's like scary and unhelpful, and they don't need to be thinking about that. But actually, it gives children an opportunity to experience their own conflicts, their own feelings through those stories. And it gives them a lot of solace, and it gives them a lot of reassurance that you can have those feelings and you can have these experiences, and it's okay. This things can be resolved. I think that at this time also, parent-child relationships are really important. It's a really amazing opportunity to build that relationship, and to give time, and to spend time with your children, and to, but a client told me that she's rediscovered her children. She's learned so much about her children that she didn't realize before. And how grateful she is in some ways to this time, that it's given her a chance to really connect. I want to say a couple of words about the adolescents. I don't know if this is relevant to anyone here, but I think adolescents are presented with their own set of problems here, because if they are in the lockdown, or if they are not able to have the same freedom of movement, then they for adolescents, having social life, it's a developmental stage. It's a process in which they have to really, it's a developmental phase to connect to a peer group. So now if they don't have that opportunity, that can be very challenging. So I think kind of understanding that and being supportive around that, and supporting these opportunities when they are available, I think that's really, really important. So talking about our own inner resources, there are so many things to say about it. I will just mention a few, and then, as I said, if we want to, if there's a need, we can talk about that later, or, in the questions and so, sharing kind of time. I think it's really important to try to find what supports you. So I'll spill the beans. The first picture on the left, it's a picture of the beach. It's very much my mental health intervention. I needed to feel sane and good, and so I will look for an opportunity to do that when I can. It can also look like gardening. It can also look like taking, to walk in the park. It doesn't have to be a beach literally, but somehow connecting to what supports you, and something that's grounding, something that connects you to the earth, or connects you to some concrete aspect of reality. For other people, it's being more physically active. So that's my second sort of pictures, you know, trying to hint at that. For other people, it can also be learning something, although I think by now 6 months of this Zoom, I feel like people are kind of zoomed out by learning and, you know, these courses. And I think in the beginning was so exciting, but I think now it's a little bit, you know, I mean, there might be an overload of that, but I want to say I've had a client who shared with me of how she's been rereading a lot of classical literature over this period of time and how supportive that was to her, to think back of you know, classical pieces that really speak to human suffering, really speak to human dilemmas, and how supportive it was to her to feel kind of be a part of it, you know, to be a part of that, you know, to feel that, yeah, that they gave her a sense of solace and a real sense of connection to a sense of meaning of that. A perspective, I suppose. Again, what I want to say, whatever you do find, I think what I would like to say, what's really important is that these activities are energy supportive. That somehow they're giving you energy. That somehow they're offering you a sense of that you're recharging your battery somehow. And that, as I said, maybe different from person to person. But I think they need to be considered, you know, actively, you know. The other things that I think they're kind of pretty much more obvious, but I will say them anyway because of you know, the kinds of jokes that kind of float around that sometimes I think indicate we're not doing enough of that. You know, it's important to have a good routine, even if we're at home or even the routine doesn't feel normal anymore, but to have some kind of routine that creates some kind of a container. You know, getting dressed and getting dressed, and even if you're not going to work, but look like if you're working at home, that you actually look like you are, that you're working rather than, you know, because I think that, you know, it kind of frames your mind a little bit to that separation between resting and not resting, because otherwise it can be that you ended up not feeling like you're not resting ever. And I think that's really important. Having meals, some kind of separate boundaries around meals rather than eating all day long, because it's very easy to do that when you're at home, if you are at home. Setting goals sometimes, setting goals for the day or setting goals for the afternoon or the morning. Again, I think it speaks to what I'm trying to get at is this idea of having some kind of boundaries and some kind of routine. And I think this is really important to try to continue to connect to our friends through our social networks, in whatever form is possible, because this is a situation that can feel very alienating, and I think it's really important to try to try to maintain those relationships that are supportive to us. And what I have found over these months is that some of my friendships have really flourished, and some of my friendships really have sort of not flourished or became much less visible in some ways in my life. And I think that that can be that's been an eye-opener for me, and was very also connected, you know, really connected me to what is important to me, what isn't important to me. So so social relationships or can also go through its own kind of metamorphosis during this time. But I think there's something, even if we cannot see our friends, I think it's so important to try to remember that we do have a social network. There are people that care about us. There are people that love us, and that, you know, they're still out there and we're still in relationship with them. So I suppose a few more points just to reflect on is really acknowledging feelings, not distracting yourself from them, giving yourself an opportunity, because feelings do need naming. They really need to be named and related to. Even if we don't necessarily spend hours thinking about them, but just to really pause from time to time and ask yourself, like, how am I feeling? How does that feel to be me right now? You know, what's going on for me? I think an important thing to really remember is that some of what we may be feeling is this anticipatory grief, which is really another way of thinking about anxiety, of things that could happen to us, you know, could happen to our loved ones. They may not happen, but considering this pandemic, it's very natural, I think, to worry about it and feel anxiety about it. So to try to kind of bring that into balance can be very helpful and very important. And accepting changes that are happening around us, sometimes without having enormous amount of with having some kind of distance between us and them, because there are some changes that will happen around us. We have no control over it. We may have a contribution to it, and we may act towards that from a place of our values, but that's all we can do. And I think that's really can be quite key here, is working out what your values are and trying to act from that place rather than acting from this kind of reactionary place. When you're having a reaction and you want to act on it, but trying to sort of react from that place can be very, very supportive and can feel really good. And I think the other thing I think that's very important is to really try to make time for wellness. And that means different things to different people. That means jogging for some people. It means taking care of oneself in a different way. But I think that creating some time for that, or some space for that, however little that may be, can be really important. I'm a big proponent of meditation and mindfulness. I'm not saying everybody has to be, but I do think that's very useful. So I would encourage you to think about incorporating that into your daily life, daily routine. And I'm just talking about the most kind of easiest way of trying to practice mindfulness from that kind of non-judgmental observation, just kind of seeing things as they are. It can be as simple as, I'm speaking to you now and I see on my laptop in front of me, and I see a glass of water, and there's all of you who I'm speaking to, and that's my observational position right now. And there's a lot more I may be feeling, or I may be projecting, or maybe, but that's something separate. So if we can kind of begin to train ourselves to be in that frame of mind, that can be useful. In breath meditation, again, I'm not saying everybody has to meditate, but it's been my experience that it's very, very useful to people. You may have different applications that teach, there's so much that's available around meditation. It's in its own webinar. But I do find that if people practice a very simple breath meditation, where you just place yourself in a comfortable place, and you just allow yourself to notice your breath, not changing in any way, just allowing it to be there, without, and just being with it for 5-10 minutes a day, and doing that every day can make a dramatic difference to how you relate to yourself. And what happens is that also with this practice is that eventually you'll begin to notice things will come up, feelings, thoughts, reactions that will be very helpful to know that is going on for you. And then you'll have an opportunity to relate to it, or incorporate it into your life, or understand that needs attending to. But it's a very simple practice. But in its simplicity, sometimes it can be challenging, because when you practice it, sometimes you actually realize how difficult it is to do that, because your mind will wander here, there, and everywhere. But if you just practice the simple practice, and you bring your mind back without a judgment, you just bring it back, because you understand that your mind will wander. It's just what it does. It's supposed to do that. I definitely recommend it, and I incorporate it very much in my work and my personal life. It's very much kind of foundational piece to my own mental health. So in conclusion, I would just like to, in conclusion to this piece, I'd just like to share what I would like to offer in terms of addressing some of the things that I talked about today, and being of help to others. I am going to pilot and try and start this new online group support project that will be based on my experience with group therapy, but also based on the idea of the understanding of how important it is, how group support how useful it can be in this time. particularly because we're not in physical places together so often. And it will be really for people to get more support dealing with the issues that we discussed today, can gain more resilience, to feel more grounded, to feel more calmer, to feel more stressed, less anxious. And of course, we'll be dealing with all of these things in more depth. So it'll be a regular space. We'll last for an hour and a half. And how I'd like to structure this, like I will give, and each time I will give maybe a 20 to 30 minutes presentation, or I will speak to a subject or to something that I either think that might be helpful, or hopefully it will also be indicated to me by people who are in a group. It will be a small group, 7 people maximum. And I hope this can be, I mean, the positive thing about online is that it can include people from different places. And I think that can be very rich as well, and I think that feeling of knowing that you're not alone and we're all going through this experience together can be very helpful. So if anybody's interested, or if you know anybody else who might benefit from it, by all means, please get in touch with me, and I will give you more information about the structure and the prices and all that. And of course, if anybody's interested to speak to me further about anything that we talked about, or you may be interested to discuss some of the things that discuss, if there's a way which I can be helpful to you, then please let me know. I offer a 30-minute free call to do that, as long as it's scheduled this week. So here's some more contact details about me. So you can keep in touch with me via the Facebook page, or you can email me, or you can just leave your name or email in the chat box, and then, we can be in touch like that. So this concludes the part that I prepared. So I'm going to stop. First of all, I'm going to stop share, and I'm going to stop the recording so that we can talk.